you very much indeed. Thank you for that introduction. I'm now so old, I can just about remember the first talk I gave to this group. It was a good few years ago, and I think it was in a pub, maybe near Bermondsey, Southwark. That's it. So there we are. What I think I'm going to do is talk a little bit about Corbyn. I'm then going to touch briefly on the budget, and because since I've arrived, all the questions that I've actually got at that table over there have been on the European Union, I'm going to just briefly describe what I really think is going on in that debate and that referendum process. So what I'm going to do tonight is speak in as scholarly way as I can. What I've found in the past when I talk about Westminster, or I talk about some years ago, and for example a recording that Brian made with me back in 2009 or 10 about Cameron, is I speak with a fairly neutral voice. I don't come over as a left-winger, right-winger, whatever. I just provide, and I find it works if I just put a different hat on, which is what do I think is going on. And the reason I'd like to do that is because when I think about Westminster, I suppose I draw on my experience, not just my academic background, but I draw on my time in Slovakia, where I worked as the head of a policy to a prime minister, and as my nearly 10 years as a lobbyist for a major British industry, the private healthcare or independent health and social care sector. So it's really with my experience that I meld together my opinions. And some of them you might like, some of them you might not. But I'm speaking to you tonight as someone who's just trying to cut through, if you will, the politics of it and just present fairly objectively what I think is really going on in the minds of the players involved. So Corbyn, I think, is an interesting character. I suspect that if you were in the establishment, if you were a senior general or admiral or an assistant chief of the general staff, or you were interested in subversion and the brief of the security service MI5, because their brief is to defend parliamentary democracy, then you might have some questions about some elements of what we might call the hard left that are now involved in the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn was born in 1949 to very charming middle-class parents. They met at Conway Hall during the Spanish Civil War. They were a classic socialist couple of their time. Jeremy was raised in that tradition. He is one of 4 brothers. You might, some of you know his other brother, Piers, who is a global warming or climate change skeptic and weather forecaster. Has another brother who I believe was a test pilot for Concorde. So an interesting family, quite a diverse family. Jeremy didn't do that well academically. He got a couple of grade E's at A-level. He didn't succeed at university. But his early career was steeped in classic trade union and local left-wing activity. So he was an official for a number of trade unions, and eventually he rose and became a member of Haringey Council. He's long lived in Islington, and he became a Labour MP in, I believe, 1983. If you care to look at some of the early day motions he put down between, let's say, 1985 and 1992, then you will find that it was a classic, almost comical, hard left strategy. He would congratulate the North Korean Workers' Party and look forward in his early day motion to the reunification of Korea. He would congratulate what was in effect a Soviet front organisation at the time, the World Peace Council, and he would look always to further peace. He might congratulate one day Fidel Castro for his advancing of healthcare in Cuba, and a little bit later congratulate Nicaragua for its revolutionary drive. If you look at his early day motions from 1985 to the early 90s, it is, as I've said, it's almost a caricature. I mean, it is one organisation after the other. But Corbyn has never been part of what you might think of as an extreme or Stalinist left. If you look at a range of well-known British left-wingers, you'll find that Tony Benn was in a very, very British Christian socialist tradition. Michael Foot was somewhat different to Tony Benn. He was a libertarian socialist, a classic Hampstead intellectual, and he thought of himself as a libertarian socialist. Jeremy Corbyn, as he's grown and developed intellectually over the years, thinks of himself being not a Christian socialist and not a libertarian socialist. He thinks of himself as being a democratic socialist. Now, these distinctions are important, and they're as important is, are you a mutualist? Are you a minarchist? Are you a classical liberal? Are you an objectivist? Are you the melding thereof? What are you? And just as you'll find cleavages and disagreements within those different schools and philosophies and traditions, so I think it's important to understand academically that there are indeed profound differences, certainly with what you might call the Labour Party and the activist and intellectual wings of this country's left. Corbyn, I think, was also being influenced by elements of a romantic Leninism, and he's also been influenced by Trotskyism. That would be inevitable in a way, because his generation he would have had friendships, friends, alliances with people who were formerly involved in militant tendency. But as a democratic socialist, he would be interested not necessarily purely in top-down models of Stalinism or nationalising great swathes of industry. It's slightly more nuanced than that. He'd be interested in things like worker councils or cooperatives. There was a very telling moment recently when Corbyn and I believe the Shadow Chancellor said that if there was a Labour government in the future, whereas under the Tories you get the right to buy, under their administration you would get the right to own. And you might have noticed that, it was in the national press, but it's interesting that the Conservative Party didn't pick up on it. Probably because they literally didn't know how to read it. What on earth does that mean? And it reminded me of the Conservatives grappling with Tony Blair in the early mid-90s. You know, what is he? He talks about diversity, a stakeholder society, community, commune. He must be a Marxist. So they put those adverts up with demon eyes, as if, you know, everything was going to be nationalised and tax was going to be put up to 90% or something. I think the Conservative Party are as confused and as ill-informed in understanding Corbyn and where he's coming from as they were initially in understanding Tony Blair. Of course, Tony Blair and Corbyn are totally different, but it's about information, intelligence, and understanding what's going on. If you are a democratic socialist in the tradition of Corbyn, then you will tend to look to countries like Venezuela and their attempts to materially and conditionally liberate poorer people as some kind of role model. But democratic socialism is very different from parliamentary socialism, or indeed what the Fabian Society originally called the parliamentary road to socialism. And I'm very mindful that this pub is in Dartmouth Street, It's just been demolished, but over the road there's a great big site. That's where the Fabian Society were, the world's first think tank, established in 1884, 1885. I believe the Fabians disagree about the year. Was it 84 or 85? Because I think they were formed over Christmas. The Fabian tradition was a belief in incremental advances for socialism, but within a parliamentary context. For Jeremy Corbyn, things like worker councils, cooperatives, mutuals, and party democracy, that somehow is elevated above elements of what they would read as the bourgeois affectations and trappings of Parliament in the current system. There are many scholars who have long argued on the left, and Professor Colin Lees is a good example. There are many others when they looked at the Labour Party, that in many ways the Labour Party, certainly under the auspices of the Fabian Society, that the Labour Party has spent just over 100 years, when it did gain power, in managing capitalism. That's actually what it ended up doing, managing capitalism. And Corbyn and his crew and his associates don't want to manage capitalism. They want to do something different. And in their minds, they don't want to go back to the socialism, or as they call it, socialism 1.0, the Soviet model, which sometimes they call state capitalism. Confused, you will be. But they now talk about the 21st century. They talk about questions like what will become of money, what about the role of central banks. They analyse the power structures of the current capitalist order. And they're doing so in a way that actually, in some instances, resonates with some of the questions that some of you in this room might also articulate. If you intellectually want to explore some of the people around Corbyn, look at the New Economics Foundation, or indeed look at groups which would really overlap with a lot of you in terms of views on money, groups like Positive Money. Now, of course, I'm not going to go into, well, what if Corbyn was to come to power? Would he be Prime Minister, or would he be replaced by somebody even more of the left, or would he be eaten by his own revolution, whatever? But what I think I can explain is what I think is going on in Corbyn's mind. I think he and people like him on the left of the Labour Party, they would say they've had a bellyful of triangulation. That, of course, New Labour as a phenomenon was partly constructed by a kind of Anglo-US investment program, we'll call it that, under the auspices of the British-American project. It's now called the British-American Project for the Successor Generation. An awful lot of well-known Labour people, when they were younger, were flown to the United States. They were given fellowships at places like the Brookings Institution. They went on courses, they got scholarships, they received all kinds of training. And in some quarters of the London diplomatic community, that New Labour generation, and it wasn't just Blair in London, there were others right across Europe, people like Schroeder in Germany. In diplomatic quarters in London, that sort of fairly free market, if you will, right-wing generation of right-wing, New Labourite, London diplomatic quarters, and I was recently with a diplomat who joked about it, they're called the CIA left. If you're Corbyn, and you're on the left of the Labour Party, you feel you've been manipulated, marginalised, vilified, and out-triangulated, not just by Blair, but by powerful forces behind them. And I can give you the scholarly references for this if any of you are interested later. Because of this, I think that you'll find that Corbyn and McDonnell will try, certainly as they get near an election, to out-triangulate their opponents in unexpected ways. One of the first policy statements that the Labour Party made, that MacDonald articulated when Corbyn became Labour leader and he became Chancellor, was the idea of helicopter money, that we might have to resort to helicopter money. But note that when MacDonald did it, he talked about this being an idea, and the media talked about it being an idea from Milton Friedman. There was the triangulating mean. And I revert back to what I said about the Tories will give you a right to buy, but we believe in you having ownership. So I think you can expect all kinds of triangulating games coming. But I'm not sure, if truth be told, that Corbyn, in his mind, really expects to be Prime Minister. I think in his mind, the worst case scenario is that he's playing a slightly different role. I think he thinks that he is rather like Barry Goldwater in America in the mid-60s. And of course, you really couldn't have had Ronald Reagan, you couldn't have had that caucus in America taking control in the early 80s if Barry Goldwater and his movement hadn't existed nearly 2 decades before. What Corbyn's really interested in doing, and those around him, people like Seamus Mill and MacDonald and others are doing, is reinvigorating the British left, bringing on a new cadre, reconnecting them to an updated 2.0 socialism, and building something that will have much more impact from the mid-20s or the early 2030s onwards. Many of you are familiar with the Overton window. In effect, what we're talking about is that you develop a cadre, you have meetings like this in pubs, you think the unthinkable, rather like the Institute of Economic Affairs did in the 50s and 60s. But over time, those unthinkable ideas, things like, for them, privatisation or contracting out, eventually they move more mainstream and they become the common currency of debate. Of course, if you look at it from the left's point of view, why would they want, if truth be told, to win power in 4 or 5 years' time? Because they won't have the size of movement, they won't have the cadres, and they won't necessarily have developed the body of knowledge for their socialism 2.0. So I think that they're in business for a longer range project. And I also think that part of that, the Trotskyist and Leninist element, if you will, about tactics, will be that we're going to see more centralisation of authority and power to the leader, to his NEC. We're going to see constitutional changes to the Labour Party, and that this democratic left are going to take hold of that Labour Party, and they're not going to want to let it go. Momentum is, I think, the first of several vehicles that will go on, that will be, if you will, at the vanguard of building these new cadres. And I think that they will pitch in all kinds of scholars and thinkers and writers and academics to build, particularly for the 2030s. So when you hear, for example, people like Paul Mason, the Channel 4 economics guy, formerly, talk about, or Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, getting involved with Corbyn's crew, or you look at, as I mentioned, the New Economics Foundation, I think this is the beginning of this element of the left's process of creating their body of knowledge and going through what classical liberals or free marketeers or civil libertarians did through the IEA 40, 50 years ago. I think at the moment there's probably, I would suggest, a 1 in 20 chance of this group taking power in 2020. But as you move out and as they build, what it would mean is that the Conservatives would have to remain in power and that they can't afford, from their point of view, to mess up once. And I would suggest to you that a lot of people, particularly in the Conservative Party and on the right of British politics, might think that Corbyn or Momentum is all a bit of a joke. Well, it might be, it might not be. I'm not making a judgment. But if they are worried by him and what he might do and where his ideas might go, then, well, they better be pretty sure that they're prepared to remain in power for the next 5, 10, 15, 20, or 25 or 30 years. So I park that, and I'm just going to move on to talk very briefly about the forthcoming budget, and then I'm going to finish with my view on the Euro debate and try and raise your gaze as to what really might be going on. This country is now in debt to roughly 1.6 trillion pounds. And the deficit is probably, I haven't looked recently, but it's probably being reduced to an overspend of a mere 68 to 75 billion a year. Note there are only 365 days in a year, so let's say it's 70 billion. That's a lot of money. And that's a lot of money for a deficit and for a rate at which you're accruing ever more debt. Cameron and Osborne are classic triangulators. And one of the consequences of Corbyn moving the Labour Party to the democratic socialist left is that the Conservative Party has been almost forced to become a bigger tent party. It has got to cover the terrain of some classical liberals and libertarians, some traditional high Tories, some would-be STP voters. That's one of the consequences of Corbyn if you're sitting in number 10. You have to become a broader tent party. Osborne, I think his view is we have onerous debt, we have a huge struggle to reduce the deficit. He and the Treasury and the Bank of England have been playing for time. Britain is trying to rebalance its relationships, to keep trading relationships in Europe, get in more with India, do more with China. Notice, to the annoyance of Washington, how Britain moved so quickly to be involved in the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Notice how actually I think Osborne is encouraging the London Stock Exchange to partnership with the German Bourse, and that together they can be major partners in China. Notice how Chinese bonds are now being traded Hong Kong, but also in London. And also note that the Chancellor has got a vision of reducing the state to 36.5% of GDP, which is actually lower than Thatcher achieved and any other administration in recent decades. But the challenge is to do that from his point of view, but to do it now under the auspices of a big tent semi-SDP approach. So, of course, because Britain is a fairly successful democracy with a good military, it has been up to this point a fairly reliable unitary state with good rule of law and a solid market economy and a highly skilled population, a highly skilled labour force. A lot of people trust us. We have a good reputation in the world, 5th biggest economy in the world. I think that the British state, under the auspices of the Treasury, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, have been trying to re-engineer deftly the direction of the country, its trading relationships, but do so in such a way where they're not accused of being very right-wing. And they are triangulation masters. They have learnt their lessons in this government from people like Blair. Blair learnt a lot from Thatcher, but these Tories have learnt. An example of that, I thought it was interesting, a lot of people think, oh, you know, Cameron doesn't believe in this, he doesn't believe in that, he's a triangulator, he's a bit like Blair. But I don't remember anyone accusing him of a right-wing move when he got away with privatising the Royal Mail, or to be more accurate, getting his coalition partners in the Lib Dems to oversee the privatisation of Royal Mail. And that's just a little vignette, little window of how triangulating politicians work. Again, Cameron would love it if people on his right, or on the free market right, whinge about him being too middle of the road. He needs them to whinge so he can grind on trying to get George to deliver that reduced state to 36.5% GDP. But the consequence of Corbyn in British politics is that the Conservative Party are getting sucked into that Big Ten strategy. So last couple of words on Brexit. I believe if you sit in number 10 at the moment, if you look at, if you can see the world, if you think like Jeremy Corbyn, you can look at the world from his point of view, you can see it. If you see the world from the Chancellor at number 11 Downing Street, you can see it. If you're David Cameron and you're looking at the forthcoming referendum, then actually you've set up a win-win for yourself. If David Cameron wins the referendum and Britain remains in the EU, it's a straight win. But if David Cameron loses the referendum, then trust me, there will be a plan B. And I would suggest to you that the plan B involves Germany. You see, if we were here 5 years ago, the German elite were fairly unified. They absolutely believed in the European Union and the Euro project. But if you now look at the people around Merkel, if you look at the leaders of German industry, if you look at people at the top of their finance ministry, they're no longer as unified or certain about the future of the EU. And I would roughly guess that a quarter or a third of the German elite is worried about it. It's worried about the political polarization that you see in Hungary, in France, in Poland. It's worried about the increasing levels of debt in Southern Europe, and for whatever reason, the inability to structurally reform. I think it's safe to say there is a large swathe of the German elite who actually want there to be structural reform. And they would love it, actually, if Britain was to vote to pull out of the EU, because it will give them the excuse for an EU-wide strategic refresh. They don't want to get the blame for a strategic refresh for interesting cultural and historical reasons. But they'd love it if the Brits would say we're pulling out, and then the Germans can say we need a strategic refresh, we can't let them go, we need a bit of zero-based policy. And the Brits are quite good at what I might call those diplomatic Dunkirk moments, where we retreat and we help create an inflection point, a punctuation point in continental politics and economics. Trade, of course, won't stop because we're members of the WTO. And even if you look at the Lisbon Treaty and you look at Articles 8 and Articles 50, then the EU is bound by its own rules to make sure that there's some sort of rapprochement, good neighbourliness, and that trade carries on. But what this means is that the German elite, I think, will fragment, and that Merkel and the government will come under huge pressure not to let Britain go off, but for there to be a renegotiation. Now, you might remember that a little while ago, Boris Johnson flew to China. And Boris landed, and Boris got on very well with the Chinese. And he started to talk about deals, and he was at the vanguard of that, let's rebalance our exports. And the Chinese liked Boris, and very quickly, Boris was so successful, he picked up the phone back to George in London. You might remember that George got on a plane, changed his diary, got on a plane, yes, so you remember it, and he flew to China. And there were very important conversations. And what resulted were bond deals, the Asia Infrastructure Bank that I mentioned earlier, and now we're at the vanguard of that. Of course, if you're American, Britain still maintains its special relationship. There's still signatories of that 1946 UK-US Signals Intelligence Treaty. NSA and GCHQ still cooperate. So we've still got a special relationship. It's just that we are casting our eyes for trade and growth further to the east, to India and indeed to China. Somewhat to the annoyance of some friends in Washington. But Boris built the bridge, and George picked up the phone and flew over. One could imagine that if Britain votes to pull out of the EU, Boris might indeed get on a plane and go to Berlin, and there will be a day or two, a week or two of concern on all sides. And that quarter or third of the German elite who want to use that moment as the inflection point for the strategic refresh, they will be there, they will meet Boris, and it might be that there is indeed a call from Boris to George and the PM, and that what the British public believes might be a Brexit is actually a window where we all take stock, trade will carry on, and there will be a new deal to be done. And in diplomatic circles in London, behind the scenes, that is plausibly accepted by many well-informed people as something that is probably part of the contingency planning process. And contingency plans are very important if you're in government. The Home Office spends a lot of time and money contingency planning for all kinds of disasters. National treasuries and finance ministries do the same. The Germans do it, the French do it. But what might come from this might be a new Anglo-German alliance. And it might be that that strategic refresh, if it were to happen, will raise into questions about the relationships of Northern Europe, or to use an historical view, what used to be the Hanseatic League, that fiscally conservative trading northern countries, and the Hanseatic League did have a wharf in the City of London, as a plaque went up to it recently, that might be reformed. There could be a two-speed euro, but it might be that Brexit, in that kind of black and white, in or out, is slightly more opaque or blurred, and to be mediated and negotiated than many people might think. So that's my view. Corbyn is playing a long-term intellectual game. The Conservative Party are big tent triangulators, and I think it could be that for all the disagreement and turpitude and for all the heat between our Etonian Prime Minister and our Etonian Mayor, it could be that there is indeed something up their sleeves. Even if they haven't spoken about it, often in politics when it comes to strategy, you can read each other from afar, and it's a bit like courting or dating. It's a bit like seduction. You can kind of know which part the other might play if certain circumstances were to transpire. So I hope that helps. Thank you very much.